Vern Jones, who is going to speak to Walter RECA, another name that has been in the media quite a bit recently. Vern is a multi-business entrepreneur with a passion for storytelling and bringing truth to light. A student of the sciences, he has since become an author, publisher, and speaker, not to mention golfer, hiker, scuba diver, water skier, and proud owner of the Portuguese water dog named DB Cooper. Vern lives with his wife, Irene, who I know is also here, sitting in the back over there in Michigan. So they came out from Michigan. So let me introduce Vern.
I'm Vern Jones. I'm the publisher and producer at Principia Media. I'm going to talk to you today about Walter RECA, the real DB Cooper. But first, I need you to meet Teddy. Teddy is the most beautiful baby in the world. I know that because she's my granddaughter. And you know, I know when I say stuff like that, all of you out there will say, well, wait a minute. I have someone in my family, a baby, that is just as pretty as that, if not better. She definitely has characteristics that Teddy doesn't. And I understand that. Some of you will agree with me and say, yeah, I think that she is the most beautiful. And then others will say, absolutely, not is she not beautiful, that's an ugly baby. I don't like your baby. And so I understand that those are all natural reactions that happen, especially when we introduced DB Cooper, the real Walter RECA, this spring after our press conference. We launched the book and then the documentary. And I just want you to know, I'm not here to call anybody's baby ugly, all right? Instead, I'd like to compliment you guys. I've read your books, I've seen your movies, excellent research. It really is, I'm impressed. I agree with a lot of the conclusions you've come to. So I know that a lot of you came to this by just delving into this unsolved mystery, which I admire. And then from that you said, okay, wait a minute, I'll make a profile of the person I think is most likely the one to fit that. And then you did incredible research after that. I agree with a lot of things you did. I know that some of us say that the money at Tenna Bar was probably planted there. Some people I agree with, they said that the money was laundered up in Canada. I agree that Cooper was an incredible parachutist. I think all those things are logical. So I agree with a lot of the things you did. We came into this in a different light. I'm a publisher. I wasn't looking to get into the Cooper vortex, trust me. That wasn't where we wanted to be. As a matter of fact, one of our editors came to me and said, you know, my uncle has a really interesting story I think that you'd be interested in. Well, as is our process, I asked Dirk, our director of publishing, I said, could you talk to this guy and see if the story is something we'd even be interested in? So Dirk talked to him for about an hour and a half, and then he called me and said, Vern, I think this is someone we may be interested in publishing. He has a really good story. And I said, great, what's the topic? And he said, well, his best friend had some incredible adventures. He did things that you aren't even going to believe. And he believes his friend was DB Cooper. And I thought, oh no, come on. The last thing we need is a new Cooper suspect. And so he said, but talk to him. You really need to talk to Carl. So I talked to Carl, Lauren, and we had a nice conversation. He invited me down to his house. He said, you have to see the evidence that I have. So I agreed. My wife and I were traveling past his place, and so she stayed at the hotel with our Cooper, our dog, and I went out to see Carl. I told Irene I'll probably be back in about an hour and a half. 6 hours later, I started on the way home, and I called Irene, and she said, what do you think? Is this guy Cooper? I said, I doubt it. But there's an incredible story about the time after the Cooper hijacking. That's a story I want to tell. See, we didn't need the Cooper thing. Wait till you hear the stories what this man did in the years 72 on. It's amazing. And that's the story that I knew that we had. But at the same time, we decided to investigate and see if there was any value to what Carl was saying about his friend Walter. So at that time, we began a 2.5-year investigation to either dispute or verify the things that Carl and Walter were saying. And quite frankly, if we disputed them, I was plenty happy to publish the book without the Cooper in it. So what we were looking at is the evidence that Carl presented. We weren't trying to develop a theory, we were really trying to either verify or refute the evidence. So this is the evidence that we have. We have a 14-year confession to Carl LAURIN. This isn't a deathbed confession. This is a conversation between two very good friends about some very unusual activities. We have a confession to Walter's sister, to his niece Lisa, and to Carl's wife Loretta. We have a written confession that Walter dictated to Carl. We have 3.5 hours of audio tapes that we have digitalized at this point, and we will be releasing the transcripts of all of them. We're going to be very open about this whole investigation. You'll see that there are things that we reveal that looks bad for our case, but that doesn't matter. If we're going to be honest about this whole thing, we're going to say, listen, this may not match, but it's there, and we're going to deal with it. We have an eyewitness. Jeff Osadich not only saw Walter, within an hour of Walter leaving SeaTac, he interacted with him, he helped him get a ride home, and he recognized Walter on site. We know this landing zone. I know you guys aren't going to like my landing zone. Sorry about that, all right? I'll tell you how we arrived at it, but I will tell you, we really believe that this is a landing zone. Is it the route that you like? I don't care. All I know is that this is where the guy landed, and that's what we'll cover. The other thing is, I want to know why Walter wasn't investigated. As you'll see, he was one of the most accomplished parachutists in the country, and certainly in the Northwest. He frequented the drop zones. He knew Kazi, and out of all the parachutists, Walter wasn't investigated. You have to wonder why. We had a DNA mystery. Most of you don't realize that we have submitted DNA. We did, and I'll tell you how that all played out, but it was very unusual. And we'll talk about the money. The money at Tenebar, and the money that Walter spent, and the money that Walter hid. Those are the things that we'll be talking about. First, let's talk about Carl. Carl Charlie Brown. Everyone called him Charlie Brown. If you listen to the audio tapes on our documentary, you'll hear Walter calling him Charlie all the time because that was his nickname. That's what they called him. Charlie was an Army paratrooper. He lived in Flint. He was raised in Flint. But like most of the suspects, he was a paratrooper. After he got out of the Army, he didn't like the paratrooting because it was static line, and they decided they wanted to try to jump out of a plane without that. He found another friend, Art Lucier, who was also an Army paratrooper, and the two of them began jumping. They convinced an airport owner up in Saginaw, Michigan, to allow them to rent the airplane, to take the side door off, a little 152, a two-seat plane, take the seat out, and one of them fly while the other one jumps out. These guys did crazy things. They should not be alive today. Art passed away recently. Carl is still alive. But they did stupid things. They jumped from 800 feet. I was talking to parachutists, they're like, that's just stupid. I mean, they had contests to see who could deploy their chute when their feet were closest to the ground. That was a contest they had. That's stupid. They flew and they jumped every weekend in Michigan throughout the year, in the summer, in the winter, and rain, in snow, and frozen ground. Yes, they broke legs. As a matter of fact, Carl's wife, Loretta, the day she first met Walter, Walter's wife was Loretta's friend, he broke both legs on the same day. He broke one. The guy said, I'm not going to wait for you around here. We're going to go up and jump again. He said, well, the heck with it. I'm going to go. My wife's not coming for a while, so I'm going to jump too. And he broke the second leg. That's how Loretta met Walter. If you think I'm making these up, this is a book by Michael Abrams. It's called Birdmen, Batman, and Skyflyers. There's an entire chapter on Carl and Art. And there are pictures of Walt in the bird suit on the plane. That's what these guys did. Carl was also a commercial pilot. He literally flew around the world. He flew to Southeast Asia often, to Indonesia. He flew to South America. He had a routine flight that went from Detroit out to Sacramento at the Air Force Base. He flew into SeaTac, Portland, Reno. He knew this area. And Carl was honest. Every time Carl would tell this story about one of the Michigan parachute team, he'd say, there's no way in the world that's true. And then all of a sudden you'd look it up. One time he talked, there's a movie out, American Made. And it's about Barry Seal. It's a Tom Cruise film, and it's about Barry Seal. When I was talking to Carl about that movie, he said, well, you know Art Lucier, the guy that founded the club, yeah, he was arrested with Barry Seal that day. I said, no, he wasn't. Come on, that's crazy. Well, look up the grand jury testimony. The first person witnessing was Art Lucier. Absolutely. So these guys, and Carl is honest. People around the area know Carl's word is the truth. And he was Walt's trusted friend. That's why he ended up being the one to tell the story. He was a pretty good writer, but he was Walt's trusted friend. Walt kept very few friends, and those that he kept, they were very close to him. But that's how he decided to allow Carl to tell the story after he died. Carl first suspected Walter on the night of the jump. He and his wife were sitting in DeLand, Florida, where they live. They watched the footage, and they heard that this guy had parachuted out of an airplane. And Carl's first reaction was turn to Loretta and say, what the hell did Walt just do? Within an hour, he got a call from Art Lucier that called Carl and said, did you see what Walt just did? The weird part is none of them knew that Walt was in the Northwest at that time. They had no idea. But the reason they believed it was after the parachute team would jump, they would go to Lucier's house, they would eat, they would drink a lot of beer, and they would tell stories. These guys were not choir boys. Walt and a couple of his friends robbed places on occasions when they needed money. And Carl and Art both remembered Walt would always say the perfect robbery would be to rob an airplane and parachute out. That was why they suspected him immediately. This is Walter. He was born Walter PECA, and then he became Walter RECA. He was raised in downtown Detroit. His father was a college student. His mother worked, and he was raised by his grandparents. One set spoke Polish, the other set spoke Russian. He was fluent in Russian and Polish before he learned English in Detroit. He learned English when he finally got to school. He was orphaned at the age of 6. His father was electrocuted in an industrial accident, and he was literally left, he and his sister, on the streets. He had his first encounter with the law. He was first arrested at the age of 10. He had multiple encounters with the law after that, until he was old enough to enlist in the Army. He enlisted in the Army. He was stationed in Germany, and he was assigned to be a paratrooper. In 1957, he got out of the Army, and he used the GI Bill to become a barber. By all accounts, a really terrible barber. There are several instances where he got in fistfights with his customers that the haircut was so bad. So I think we can kind of assume he wasn't the best barber, all right? But it was at the same year that he joined the Michigan parachute team. In 1961, the barber thing wasn't working out very well, as you can imagine, and so he decided to get a job, and he got a job with the Teamsters as a picket line organizer. He very quickly worked his way up for the next 4 years into the enforcement division of the Teamsters. Also in 61, he joined the United States Air Force Reserve. He became a rescue and survival specialist in the 305th Air Rescue Squad. Now I can tell you that Walter kept saying, I didn't really plan this out. There wasn't really a plan, Charlie. But I have to believe that when he was in that Portland airport on that morning, and he looked at the available flights, Flight 305 probably had special meaning to Walter at that point. In 1962, he said, all right, this isn't working out for me. I have a lot of skills that I think the CIA might need. And he heard that the drop zone in Elsinore, California, was actively recruiting parachutists from there. So he made the trip from Detroit out to California, and he went to the drop zone. He made a lot of jumps out there. He met a lot of people, and he met one guy that would be in his life for the rest of his life. That was Philip Q. We do know his last name. We don't have permission to use it, as you'll guess later. But it was Philip Q, who was a friend for the rest of his life. And Philip convinced him that he should apply to the CIA. We know that he applied to the CIA because we have the rejection letter from the CIA in September of 1963. The rejection from the CIA really changed Walter's life. He kind of went into a dark period at that point, to the point, well, he was drinking heavily and making really bad decisions. One of the bad decisions was to tell his wife that he was going out for a loaf of bread and some milk, and he never returned to her or the 2 children again. Another bad decision was he and his friend, while drunk, there's alcohol as a theme here, while drunk decided that it would be a good idea to rob a big boy in northern Detroit. Walter went in with a machine gun. He said it was empty. We don't know. And he held it up. There was a female manager. He pointed the gun at her and said, "I need all the money out of your safe." She opened it and put it in a bag for him. And then he reported that he took some of the bills out of there and put them down the manager's blouse and said, "This is for you, dear. Thanks for the trouble." He's also reported that he left some bills at each of the tables for the inconvenience these people were through. He walked out and was arrested almost immediately, even before he made it to the getaway car. Unfortunately, the guy that was his getaway driver was parked the wrong way on a one-way street. The police were actively writing him a ticket when the APB came in, and they did arrest him. He went directly to jail. Carl and Loretta went to see him in jail the next morning, and a woman was walking past them as they were going to Walt's cell. And Walter said, "Did you see that woman?" And he said, "Yeah, I did. What is the deal?" And he said, "That was the manager. She came back to see me. And she said, I wish that we had met under different circumstances." Good sense of humor for that lady. The Teamsters bailed him out. He went directly to Jimmy Hoffa. Hoffa fired him immediately with a line that he said, "You're the kind of guy that gives the Teamsters a bad name." I think most of us can agree that Jimmy Hoffa did a fine job of that of his own. He didn't need any help, but that was the line that he used. So he was out on bond and on bail, and he immediately jumped bail. He came out to Washington State, where his friend Don lived. Don was a petty thief. He was also a paratrooper. That's how they were friends. And he came out here, and Don helped him get some jobs. Don also gave him the paperwork to actually have a new alias. So he was operating under an alias of O'Brennan. His name is James. And he met a girl. They moved in together. She already had a child. She became pregnant. They got in an argument at one point because Walt's friend Don kept calling him Walt instead of James. And so she was very suspicious of it, and she ended up calling the police. They arrested him and extradited him back to Detroit, where he stood trial. His girlfriend followed him back there because she was pregnant, and the judge let him off on probation. And of course, he jumped probation, and they all worked their way back to Washington State. He came back in '67, and he decided to then use the alias of RECA. We put blue light on some of his legal paperwork, and he just simply changed the P to an R, and you can see that was with an ink pen rather than actually a typewriter. January 1971, Phil Q is helping him get some work, and Phil said, "You know what, I'm going to get you a job part-time with Vanell Corporation." It turns out Vanell Corporation is very closely intertwined with the intelligence community all around the world, particularly in Saudi Arabia and Indonesia. As a matter of fact, there was an interview in the Newsweek magazine with one of the vice presidents of Vanell Corporation, and they said, and the guy's quote was something, I'm real close to this, but he said, people say that we're mercenaries. We're not mercenaries. Mercenaries kill people. We hire people to do that. So Walter worked with Vanell for a while, and during that time he also was working on the iron. He was a welder on the Grand Coulee Dam. So he was living in Heartline, Washington. Walter hated Heartline, Washington. It was a small town in the middle of nowhere. Trust me, I've been there. It's a small town in the middle of nowhere. He was a big city guy. He hated working on the dam. He was always in the water. It was just terrible work. And when his niece, Lisa, asked Walter, "Why did you hijack that plane?" his response was, "I was just so tired of being poor." His phrase was, "Better dead than poor." He said he had actually contemplated just falling off the iron into the bottom of the dam just so that his children would have money for a house. After the hijacking, starting in '72, he really went into a dark period. By that I mean he didn't see any relatives, any of his friends. He would leave. He was traveling all over the world. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And when he did come back, he would go into to see his niece and his sister in Las Vegas. He would stay for 1 day and then he would travel again. He would come into Detroit and be there for 1 day, have dinner with Carl and Loretta, and he'd be gone. Carl and Walter reunited in 1998. When Walter's travels were done, all the Michigan parachute team decided to have a reunion. They had a reunion in this remote cottage in northern Michigan. Basically, it involved shooting guns, drinking beer, and telling stories. And that was their reunion because they had a lot of war stories to tell when they were doing the ridiculous things. But it was in the 1998 when Walter was talking, that was the first that Carl realized that Walt was in the Pacific Northwest at the time of the hijacking. And that really accentuated his suspicion. And he started chiding Walt and calling him Cooper and stuff of that nature. And then finally, in 1999, they had the second reunion of the Michigan Parachute Club. And Carl had compiled all these stories that they had all told. He had written them all out and gave each person there a copy of all their stories. Well, in Walt's book, he added one extra chapter that talked about Walter being D.B. Cooper and planning this hijacking. And after their reunion, Carl went back home and Walt didn't say anything. They would have conversations. They would started long conversations starting in 99, but Walt didn't say anything. And finally, Carl said, "Walt, did you read the last chapter in the book that I gave you?" And he said, "Charlie, you gave me way too much credit." So their conversation started in 1999, and they went all the way through 2014. They were two friends talking together, discussing the hijacking, discussing Walt's activities after the hijacking. They would talk 2 or 3 times a week and sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. Finally, in 2008, Carl said, "You know what, I better record some of this." So he asked Walt permission, "Can I please record this?" And Walt said, "Yes, that'd be great." But he said, "Charlie, you're not releasing any of this until I die. I'm not going to go to prison." And Carl agreed. So we started doing the recordings. So you'll hear the recordings in our documentary. You'll see the transcripts. And it's clear in the recordings that Carl is leading Walter into a discussion. See, they have already had conversations for 9 years. They had already talked about these things, and now Carl wanted to get it on tape. So he would lead him into a particular topic, and you can see that. But that was why Walter never started the story and then went all the way through it. He would just tell bits and pieces, and some days he even refused to talk about it. In 2009, while the recordings were going on, Walter got sick, and Carl made the trip up to Oscoda, Michigan, where Walter lived. And he said, "Listen, I'd like to get some DNA from you. Is that okay, Walt?" And Walt said, "Absolutely not. Do not DNA me. I don't want to go to prison. Leave it alone." Well, Walt was sick at the time, and he was coughing and blowing his nose. And so when Walter left to go to the restroom, Carl used tweezers to pick up 2 of the Kleenex and put it in his sandwich bag, and he took it back to Daytona Beach with him. That's just outside Daytona. DeLand is where he lives, but Daytona Beach is the major city. So he got there and he went to an attorney, and he happened to pick a very famous attorney, David Damore. And he went to Damore and said, "Listen, this is the story. I believe that this DNA is that of D.B. Cooper. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like to have a DNA profile done on this, and then I would like you to send it directly to Agent Larry Carr in Seattle." And Damore agreed to do that. He had the profile done. He got the results. Damore called Agent Carr and said, "I'm sending this DNA profile to you, and I want to see if it matches D.B. Cooper." Damore reports that Carr said, "It's not going to match." And he said, "I don't care if it's going to match. I want to send it to you. I want you to check it out." So he overnighted it to him, and in that conversation, he asked Carr, he said, "How long will this take?" Carr said, "It shouldn't take more than 2 or 3 days, and we'll have your results." Well, over a week passed, and all of a sudden, there was a phone call, but it was to Carl, and it was Walter. And Walter said, "Why the F did you DNA me? You SOB, I'm out of this. We're not talking anymore," and he hung up. So Carl said, "Okay, great. I'm going to call Damore." Obviously, they've got the results. He calls Damore. Damore calls Carr. Carr says, "We don't have the results." 74 days after Carl received the results, received the card, the DNA profile, he had an email to DeMore that said, oh yeah, it didn't match. DeMore called him because he had been checking weekly. We saw the email receipts, or the chain that they had. And Carr said, nope, not available, not there yet. And Carr apologized for it taking 74 days. But so DeMore called him, and Carr said, yeah, I'm sorry about that. And he said, by the way, he said, when you were telling me the story about your client's friend, they called him Mr. Blank. When you were telling me the story about Mr. Blank, you said that Mr. Blank got a ride after I jumped out of the plane. And he said, yeah, that's right. And Carr said to DeMore, do you happen to know the name of the driver that drove him home that night? DeMore said, that was the craziest question ever. Why in the world does he want to know the name? I don't understand it. So I get it when you guys are talking about the FBI and not disclosing stuff. Yeah, it definitely happens. In 2012, Carl said, all right, I've got all this information and Walt's starting to get sick and it's time for me to actually see if I can pinpoint the drop zone. So he was asking Walter questions, and Walter said, you know, I didn't know where I was, but he said, when I came through the clouds, he said, I didn't have a lot of time to see anything. I was dropping pretty fast, but after I cleared the clouds, he said I could see where two rivers converged, and I could see a bridge that went over top of it. And fortunately for me, I could see a car driving down a road. He said, and then I hit a tree, I fell to the bottom, he broke a leg, go figure. And then at that point, he did what parachutists do. They wrapped up the parachute, he put it in the backpack, he put it under some branches, covered it up with branches and leaves. They're exactly right when you were talking about how he did it. He actually, when he got the money, he used the strings, or the wires from the parachute that he cut open, and the lines, and he tied it around his neck and around his waist, and he put his overcoat over top of it. He put his belt around the top of that, and then he put his parachute on. So when he took the parachute off, he then took his overcoat off, and then, as you see, instead of it being a knapsack, it was a bank bag. And he was a pretty smart guy. He knew that he couldn't walk down the street with a bank bag full of money. It would look really bad. So in the freezing rain, he took off his overcoat, he wrapped around the money, and again, used his belt to wrap that, and then he carried it under his arm. When he got out to the road, he saw a light, he went down, there was a cafe there, and he went into the cafe. He had the landmarks from the sky, but the other part was, he said, you've got to have more information than that, Walt, come on. And so they said, well, how did you get home? He said, I know how I got home. He said, what happens is when Don got me, we drove up through Blewett Pass, we went through Kashmir, ultimately to Route 2, and it took me home to Heartland. And Carl said, yes, but you know, this landing zone that I've got, I think it's like the one that looks the most promising is something like 30 miles north of Portland. And Walt says, why are you talking about Portland? I was never near Portland. Carl said, but that's where the route goes. He says, I don't care what the route says. I know how I got home. I was never near Portland. He went to this cafe. When he got to the cafe, he walked in. He said there was only one customer there. He said he described the cafe well, did he? Said there was gas pumps out front. There was a little counter there. They had a really basic menu, and they didn't serve alcohol. He would know that. And so he went to call his friend, but he had no idea where he was. And so there was one customer there, and he called that customer the cowboy. And he called him the cowboy because the man sitting there had a cowboy hat on, a cowboy shirt, cowboy boots, and he had a guitar leaning at the counter next to him. And so he asked Cowboy, would you please come over and tell my friend how to get here, because I don't know where I am. At that point he did. He came over, told Don how to get there from Seattle down to this Teanaway Junction Cafe. And then Walter said Cowboy stood up and he went out and got in a dump truck and drove away. Pretty good description of someone at that point. This 3.5 hours of audio tape, again, keep in mind, it is part of a 15-year conversation. I wish we had more, but 3.5 hours is pretty darn good. Walter talked about his motivation. Better dead than poor. That was basically where he was in life. He said he didn't prepare, but you know what he did? He talks in 2008 on the audio tapes, he talks about driving into Spokane, that's 75 miles east, to go to a thrift store because he didn't have a tie. He wanted to look like a businessman, so he bought a suit, a tie, a shirt, and a briefcase and shoes at this thrift store in Spokane. Before he went to the hijack, before he went to Portland, he didn't drive directly to Portland. He drove into Spokane to go to the bus stop there because he said, I wouldn't ever leave it in Portland or Seattle. I wouldn't do that. And so he drove there and took the bus back past his house in Heartline and then down to Portland. He talked about the hijacking. He talked about drinking liquor and cigarettes. He was a Sir Walter Raleigh smoker. Loretta remembers that distinctly. For those of you who are too young for Sir Walter Raleigh cigarettes, they had a coupon on the back of them, and you could cash them in on wonderful prizes and stuff like that. And Walter would always joke that he was going to buy a casket with his. So that was how Loretta remembered that. He remembered talking about the airspeed and the configuration. He had jumped hundreds of times. He knew that he had to get the plane as slow as possible and how to get the configuration there. He was a polite robber. I mean, he offered the stewardesses, you know that, some money. But he was also, by all accounts, very polite while he was on the plane. He remembers the ride home. He remembers when Don got there, he got in the car, they rode for a few minutes, and Walter said, I took out a few bundles of the money and I put it in Don's pocket and I said, now we're in this together. And Don's response was, you know, the prisons are filled with people like you and me. Don wouldn't talk about picking Walter up, about that evening, about that money for the rest of his life. Walter said if I started talking about it, he would hang up on me. He said, don't even try to call him and talk about it because he refuses to talk about any part of it. And the money, yeah, Walter did spend some of the money. He talks about he bought a house. He bought it on land contract from a guy who was a house flipper. He paid $685 down, and he just bought on land contract. He bought some furniture, and then he took the rest of the money up. Once his leg had healed, he went up, decided to go up into Canada. He didn't want to go through Vancouver, so he went through Sumas and put the bank in a safe deposit box there. Later, in the next few years, Philip Q taught him how to transfer the money to a bank in Montreal where it would be laundered. Walter had money in Canada till the day he died. This is our eyewitness. If you watch the documentary, I did a lot of the interviews. I interviewed Jeff because I said, I can't believe you can remember this incident from 40 years ago. It doesn't even make sense. So my first question to him is, I don't get it. How do you possibly remember an event that long ago? 1971 was my first year at college. I barely remember any of 1971. But Jeff was a former law enforcement officer. He's very well known in the Cle Elum area, extremely well known. He said that when he first answered me, he said, I was taught to observe the unusual. That entire night was unusual. Seeing that guy there was really unusual. He was dressed inappropriately, he was soaking wet, walking with, and he had this overcoat under his arm. He said, I remember those things. And that was how he answered that. So then we went to the newspaper reporter in Cle Elum, a guy named Jim Fawcett, wonderful guy. We start talking to him about, okay, listen, what do you know about this Jeff Oshaditz? And I said, we explained to him, I said, he is a witness of an event quite some time ago. And he said, and Jim's response was, if Jeff Oshaditz is your witness, you couldn't have found a better witness. Jeff is really well known. As a matter of fact, he just won the award in 2017 as Mr. Cole of that whole region. And trust me, that's an honor, okay? It sounds like it could be a prank, but it's a really incredible honor. He's on the front page of the papers and stuff. He described the encounter with Walter. When he starts talking to us, he said, okay, wait a minute, because I thought they first saw each other in the cafe. I said, so what did you think when you first saw him? He said, actually, I first saw him on the side of the road. He was walking down the road, and it was freezing, raining, it was really cold. I felt so bad for the guy, but I couldn't pull over. That was my company's dump truck, and the owner said we could never pick up passengers, and to the point where they removed the passenger seat. And Jeff was in fact on his way to play a gig that night at the Grange Hall, which we confirmed, and he said I had my amplifier in there. And then he talked about his guitar, and he said, yeah, I said, I had also had my guitar in there. If it was cold, I would definitely have my guitar in the cafe, because you never leave a good instrument out in the cold. He was talking about the terrible weather. He talked about him being dressed in a suit and with the overcoat bundled under his arm, and he said he never let it go. It was under there for good, and he just wouldn't give it up. And then he said he needed directions, and Walter had told him that his car broke down, and Jeff said, to me, that didn't make sense. If you're driving, you have a pretty good idea where you are, right? Even when your car breaks down, you have a pretty good idea. He had no idea where he was. The other thing I learned when we went out to Cle Elum, Jeff has adult children, and those children and his sister confirmed that they remember Jeff telling this story about meeting this weird man for years after that event happened at family gatherings. Our investigator is Joe Koenig. We knew that we couldn't investigate this on our own, and I respect professional investigators. We selected Joe because of his unique skills. Joe is a forensic linguist. He speaks all over the country to police forces, investigating groups about how to discern the truth. He teaches how to interrogate. He's interrogated some very famous people. So that's one of his skills. Well, all of our evidence is the audio tapes, conversations, Carl's stories, Carl's recollections. So it was really important to us that we have someone who could discern whether they're telling the truth. Joe went through and said he found no signs of deception in any of our witnesses, Jeff, Carl, Loretta, any of them. He also said, he makes the distinction. He said, I determine truthfulness. I can't attest to the facts. All I'm telling you is that he says these people believe they're telling the truth when they tell this story. Joe's also a private investigator. He is a very famous private investigator. He was the lead investigator in the Jimmy Hoffa disappearance. He is very well respected throughout the country. He helped us verify dates and events, the home purchase, the background information. Joe is an author. His first book was called Getting the Truth, Discover the Real Message. No Truth, No Deception. Joe is now has written a new book as a part of his investigation to this. It's Getting the Truth, I Am D.B. Cooper. I just want to share with you a couple we sent them to advanced readers to see if they could get some endorsements. The first one he got that came in was this. It says, Joe Koenig's exceptional ability to gather and analyze information from key witnesses and documents have resulted in a truly compelling case that Walter RECA is the real D.B. Cooper. Who said that? That was Kathleen McChesney, PhD, former second in command at the FBI behind Robert Mueller. Much credibility in my sight. The other quote, Joe Koenig's objective analysis leaves little doubt that Walter RECA is D.B. Cooper. Koenig makes a well-reasoned and compelling case that any prosecutor would consider. Michael D. Robinson, the director of the Michigan State Police and the former president of the International Association of Chief of Police. We have endorsements from judges, prosecutors, federal judge. We have some very good endorsements for this particular book. So why wasn't Walt a suspect? My gosh, he was one of the most experienced parachutists in the country. He was 38 years old. He fit the profile, same build, same height. Now the rest of the story, which I believe is why he wasn't even a suspect, wasn't even interviewed. Shortly after the hijacking, after Walter's leg healed, Walter was back at work welding. He said 2 guys came up to him in hard hats and they said, Walter, would you like to go for a beer after work? Well, you know Walter's answer, it's beer, right? And so yes, he said, I'll go. So I went to the Brown Derby in Spokane. These 2 guys came in and sat down. They ordered beer. After they got their beer, one of them turned to Walter and said, Walter PECA. Keep in mind, he'd been going under Walter RECA for several years at this point. They said, Walter PECA, do you want to go to prison for the rest of your life? He answered right. He said no. And they said, then you work for us. Now again, this was in 2008. That movie I told you about with Tom Cruise, watch how the CIA that the intelligence community recruited Barry Seal at that point. It's very, very similar. He went through a year and a half of trainings. It started in Boise, and most of the time it was there, but it was also to other small college towns throughout the Northwest. And in 1974, he got his first passport under the name of Walter RECA, even though that was still an alias. From that point on, 74 to 1986, he went to 34 different countries around the globe, Indonesia, behind the Iron Curtain. Walter had, we don't have it here, I have all the passports here. We have his diaries, he had contact numbers, bank account numbers. He would say, that's where I went to get paid for this job, he would call it. But he also had a UK passport, and he has a leather-bound identification for the KGB. When Carl would say, well, you remember when you worked for the CIA? And Walt really quickly corrected him, saying, I never worked for the CIA. I worked for all of them. So it's by all of them, we assume he meant most of the countries that were our allies. So why wasn't a suspect? Why wasn't he arrested? There's a concept that Joe Koenig taught me, and it's called the greater good. And we all know about it. We all see it. We see it in movies all the time. If I'm a federal agent and you're a local police officer and you're looking into Vern Jones because you think he's smuggling drugs, and if the CIA comes up or the FBI and says, you know what, leave Vern alone. He's ours. We have a bigger plan for him. All right, your concerns and challenges. I know, the route from SeaTac. I know that's a problem with you. I know that you have, because we all trust all the FBI. It's really strange to me that I say, I think the FBI redirected, and you guys said, no, that never happened, because they wouldn't do that, but yet we all have conflicts with the FBI reports, don't we? All right, so how did we figure out? We know where he landed. All right, we know that he walked to the Tanaway Junction Cafe, and we know he had an eyewitness that saw him and remembered him, and we had the route home to Heartline. That's what we have. By the way, remember Malaysia Flight 370? It just disappeared a couple years ago over the ocean with no visible restrictions. Yeah, that even with the technology we have today, flights do disappear. You have an issue with Walt. We left it in. There's a part where Walt says, I was going to open the side door. And people said, how stupid is that? What's wrong with him? He got in through the back stairs. Why in the world would he go to the side door? Well, first of all, we know that was an issue. I didn't have to include it in the book. We didn't have to include it in the tapes. But we did, because we want you to know what our case is. I think our argument, and what Carl clearly believes, he said he had made hundreds of jumps. Every jump he'd gone out the side door. Maybe that was a reaction. He was certainly nervous at the time. And Carl said, Carl's a pilot. He said, I can't believe the rear door of the 727 deployed with the stairs down in flight. That didn't make any sense to him. But the reality is that's what Walt said in the tapes, and that's what we're going with. And some of the lack of specific details. We've had people say, oh my gosh, why didn't Walt remember this? And why didn't we remember that? Well, it was a 38-year-old memory. He tried to forget it. He said immediately, I tried to forget it right after it happened. I didn't want to remember any of the details. And we know how difficult it is with all the assault cases and everything that happened decades ago, how hard it is to remember specific details. So it's not a surprise to the rest of us. So you see, for Walter, the hijacking wasn't the most interesting thing he ever did. He traveled the world and killed people, for God's sake, all right? It is not the most illegal. It was not the most dangerous. That's why we believe Walter is the real D.B. Cooper. Thank you.
I really enjoyed your slideshow and great information. I'm a commercial pilot, and you mentioned that were one of those guys commercial pilots or both of them?
Carl was a commercial pilot, not Walter. Right. It was for a company it was freight company out of Ypsilanti. It was called Zantac. Zantac. Yeah. They were like I said, they flew a lot of supplies from the auto manufacturers out. That's why he was flying into Sacramento. And they were going right down to Vietnam from that point, from that deportation.
Did they both live
No, they lived, at the end of Walter's life, he lived in Oscoda, Michigan, and Carl lived in DeLand, Florida. So that's why it was phone conversations much of the time, but they did each visit each other, so yeah.
For those that don't know, DeLand, Florida is the jump base.
It is.
Station. It's the jump plane.
Yeah. I did my only jump in the world there. I would do it again, by the way, but I did my first jump because I figured I have to know what these guys are experiencing, what they're liking. It's incredible. I'd do it again. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
If the CIA or whatever
Right.
is covering up RECA as D.B. Cooper, what do you think the possibilities are, or what the end game? Why would they cover up? What was the purpose for the D.B. Cooper skyjacking? And could you weigh in on, was it part of a program to federalize airline safety and get the ball rolling on metal detectors, bag inspection, ID inspection, yada, 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 everything that we've got going now?
Yeah, there's several questions there. Yeah, I would expect nothing less, Bruce. Thank you. Yeah, I don't know if, I mean, we certainly, you can guess that maybe it was part of that, because I mean, 1971 was a weird time. I mean, seriously, the race wars were going on, the anti-Vietnam War protests, the Pentagon Papers were soon to occur. The break-in at the FBI headquarters where they released all the Hoover's threats to the senators and congressmen. It was a really weird time, and you're right. There was a push to actually have more security because there was very little. I don't think it's my opinion that the intelligence community did not know. I think Walter went rogue when he did the hijacking. I don't think that was any part to do with it. I could be wrong, but I don't know that to be true. I don't know a connection, and Walter didn't mention any. So I really can't. I like to try to be clear what we believe, what we know, what we can support, and what we believe. And so, sometimes my opinion isn't worth that much. But yeah. Yes.
I'm confused about him spending any of the money that went on the serial numbers. How does that happen
Yeah.
with the bank that's buying the house?
Right. She's talking about how he spent the money, right? How in the world could he spend the money? They had all the serial numbers that were out there. We interviewed bankers. And we said, first of all, it's 1971. There are no computers. The second thing the banker pointed out was, the FBI doesn't dictate what we do in a bank. And the most important part that they told us is that, the only time they would even look, because let's face it, if you give somebody two 20s in there, they're not going to go through this huge list of serial numbers each time they get a $20 bill. They kind of have more, there would be lines out the bank, and that's not their goal, even though it seems like it to me sometimes. So, them matching it would only come up if I made a purchase or a huge amount, or I deposited a large amount of money. Well, the guy that sold him the house, he was a flipper. He owned 6 or 7 homes at that time. And we have him on film, and he said, I didn't accept a check. If you want to bring me a check, you take it to the bank, cash it, I accept cash. And so this man routinely, at the first of the month, went to the bank with a lot of cash, one would guess a lot of 20s. And so it wouldn't be unusual for him. They bought a used car. Used cars were, people, first of all, credit. It was 71. People didn't use credit cards as much. We used cash when we had to buy a used car, usually. And so that wouldn't be suspicious if a car dealership deposited some money. And in the other part, these were all used bills, so they weren't going to be in circulation for very long anyway. They take them out. And I did find out that at the Federal Reserve, when they destroy money, they don't check serial numbers. The only thing they look for, they look to see if it's counterfeit. So it was because of that, and he was over in Spokane, in that area, and up in Canada, but the rest of it he laundered. It was pretty interesting. But like I said, anything else? Thanks a lot, you guys. Thank you.